Again, just to remind you about the exam. So we're only covering, from the learning objectives and from the notes, we're only covering parts of what is in there when you look through the chapter. So be sure to focus on just the organisms and the diseases that we talk about. Okay. We're going to finish up today by looking at the digestive system, and then also looking at sexually transmitted diseases. So again, I'm just going to highlight certain pathogens, although there are other ones that are important. Okay? So when we talk about the GI tract, we're looking at the mouth, esophagus, stomach, small intestine, large intestine, rectum, and anus. We're only going to focus on a few examples that are confined, probably where you'll find them exerting their pathogenicity, is in the stomach, small intestine, large intestine. Right? So down here is where we're going to look at. Okay. Now, there are some basics that we need to go over about when we look at foodborne disease. So because we're dealing with the GI tract, we're looking at a lot of these diseases are transmitted via things that we consume. Okay, and so these are some of the outcomes that happen. A lot of the problem with foodborne diseases is that you damage or kill enterocytes, which are the cells that are in our digestive tract. Okay? Often this is mediated by toxins that the bacteria produce, so it causes fluid loss and dehydration. One that we're going to look at is going to be cholera. That's probably the most dramatic example of this, where people actually die because they lose so much fluid. Also, you can have dysentery. Right, we've heard about that. This is bloody diarrhea, also damage the colon. Again, toxins destroy the enterocytes. Shiga toxin is a good example of this, and we'll mention that. Also, there is vomiting. Okay, that's another result that can happen. So vomiting. Bacillus cereus, which is a bacteria we work with, that's a bacteria that can do that. Okay? And then also there are some examples of sepsis, where the pathogen can bypass the intestinal barrier and then spread to other parts of the body. All right. When we look at foodborne diseases, there's two types that you need to keep in mind. And these are different, although they're often looked at as the same. Right? But technically they are very different. One is called infection, the other is called intoxication. Right? Food poisoning is a form of intoxication because it results from a toxin that's in the food. So how that's different than one above, this is an infection. So in this case, there's not a toxin that's produced. What happens is that the disease symptoms are produced by the fact that bacteria just keep on multiplying, or the infectious agent that keeps on multiplying, and that's what causes the disease. Right? And so, because you're dependent on the fact that the pathogens have to reproduce and colonize your digestive tract, that's going to take a longer incubation time than, let's say, food poisoning. Okay? So when I mentioned Bacillus cereus, which one would that be?
Infection.
Okay, so remember, Bacillus cereus produces a toxin, so that would be, that's an intoxication, right? So that's going to be a food poisoning, right? So the difference is, and some of you may have experienced this, like if you have a case of food poisoning, like there's something that you eat earlier in the evening or the night before, and you're like out, you're gone, okay? You're in the bathroom. Whereas with a foodborne infection, so salmonella would be an example of this. With an infection, it might take a few days, okay, for you to start to feel sick. And if it's an infection, what else? There's also another characteristic of an infection. If you have an infection, so let me, how do I put this? What's going to happen to your temperature? Yeah, you'll get a fever, right? So often that accompanies a foodborne infection. Right? You won't get that with a food poisoning, okay? You'll be out faster, right? But you won't have an infection. You won't have a fever. But with this one, you will. Okay, so with salmonella, you will. Okay. All right. So the next time you get sick from something you eat, you can actually think about that while you're in the bathroom. Say, okay, do I have a fever? No, it's a food poisoning, right? Okay, we're going to look at some examples here of E. coli. Now, there's actually more than this. There's more cases than this, but we're just going to focus on two. One's called ETEC and one's called EHEC. ETEC is for enterotoxigenic. This is where you have typical gastroenteritis. So some of the symptoms I talked about here relate to gastroenteritis. So you have like diarrhea, you have your stomach, you have stomach pains, right? That all relates to. You may have some vomiting. That's all part of gastroenteritis. Here are the durations for 1 to 2 days. This is what's called traveler's diarrhea. Okay, so if you eat contaminated food or water, contaminated water. One that we hear about in this country is EHEC. Okay, so this is the one that comes from contaminated beef. All right, so if you have like ground beef is a good example of this. If you have ground beef that's not cooked properly or not cooked well enough, all right, the bacteria can survive and actually make you very, very sick in some cases. Okay, so this causes gastroenteritis, but can also cause more severe symptoms like dysentery, kidney damage. So one such serious outcome is called hemolytic uremic syndrome, HUS. Okay. Here the duration is longer than this form of E. coli, and also can be much more serious. Right? Now, this can be perfectly controlled by proper cooking. Right? So take that ground beef and you cook it well enough, right, that will kill all the bacteria. And that's usually the issue that's involved, is that just things aren't cooked well enough. There's other sources now that we know about, so produce can have it, all right? Yeah, so spinach, okay. Does anybody know how that happens?
Yes, the big one at the organic spinach grower in San Juan Bautista, they tracked it to cattle and farm workers'
right.
feces
Yeah.
nearby.
Yeah. So, and there was another example a couple years ago. It's actually several years ago now, with Odwalla, and with their apple cider. Okay, so they have to be near where livestock were. Okay, all right. So that changed their whole way of producing apple juice. And now they pasteurize it. So often you'll find it find a lot of the juices now pasteurized to try to prevent these problems. Okay? There was an interesting study that was done. It was actually done from Sac State, where they went around the Sacramento area and tested stores for EHEC. Okay, so they bought ground beef from the meat section from various stores like Safeway, Bel Air, okay, so forth, Nugget, and what they found was about a third of the beef you could detect EHEC. Okay, so it tells you how widespread this bacteria is. Okay. Now, just to lessen your fears, you should be fearful, but just to lessen them, it's not necessarily. There might not necessarily be enough EHEC to make you sick if you were to like take that beef and like eat it right then and there. However, there is what they know is that you can detect it. Okay, right. So that's just something to keep in mind about how prevalent this form of bacteria is. Any questions about this? Yeah.
So is that caused by the animals eating produce that's infected with feces then? That would get into their system? Is that where the E. coli
yeah, that's a good question.
Gets into the animal?
That's a good question. So, One is the way that the meat's processed, especially when it's ground beef, because it gets contaminated with all kinds of stuff. So you get some of the entrails in there, right? And that's going to have the bacteria. How the bacteria got there in the first place is an interesting question. That's still being worked out, but because of our livestock industry, where everything's mass produced, right? So if some of the livestock have it, it's very easy for others to get it. So it just becomes endemic, right? Or it's just all throughout the population, right? So part of it is related to the way that we just raise our cattle, raise our livestock. All right. So okay, here's another one. This is one I mentioned earlier, Salmonella. So this is one type of disease is salmonellosis. This is caused by Salmonella enteritis. This is the one that you get from undercooked poultry. So when you hear these messages about how you need to cook your chicken properly or cook your turkey properly, right? It's to avoid this bacteria. Okay. The other type of Salmonella is Salmonella typhi. This causes typhoid fever. And this one has a different mode of transmission. This is done by human-to-human transmission, right? So it's spread from person to person. Now that raises the question: how is it spread from person to person? Yeah, oral fecal. Okay. All right. So there is a famous case in the United States called Typhoid Mary. People know about this one. This was in the early 1900s. Turned about first half of the 20th century, and what happened was that there was Mary was like a nanny, lived-in nanny, housekeeper, and so she'd be responsible for preparing the food for the family. Okay? And what happened was that because she was infected with the bacteria, when she handled all the food she handled, plates she handled, right, would be contaminated with the bacteria. And so what happened was that the family would get sick, and they would start to die off from typhoid fever. Okay? And so then she'd move to another household, because the first family was dead. And so then they would start to get sick. Okay? All right? In fact, they told her that she had to get treated for this, but she refused treatment, and they actually had to quarantine her. They actually put her in jail. And then, surprisingly enough, the public protested this. They thought her rights were being restricted, so they let her out, and she went on infecting other people. So it's an interesting story. I don't know how I can't remember how it ended, but
People died in jail.
they extradited deport her, yeah. Okay. Yeah. In the early 1900s. Yeah. So. Yeah, she's dead by now. Yeah. Surprisingly, she never had typhoid fever because the bacteria was just like her body tolerated it. And it was in her. She was just like permanently infected with this bacteria. Okay? That's weird. All right. So anyway, that's okay. Right. So yeah, this is where the more common one is this one, and that's why you need to cook your chicken.